So good morning. My name is Bill Arise. I'm a professor of law and device dean here at Brooklyn, and I'd like to extend my welcome as well to all our visitors. Our next panel, this panel to begin, is on hate speech. Hate speech is, of course, one of the most vexing issues in the First Amendment. Now, those of us of a certain age may recall that in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we witnessed the rise of campus speech codes. That controversy ultimately faded. But that controversy over campus speech codes was only one way station in the ongoing dispute over speech that's alleged to inflict serious equality and dignity harms, especially on vulnerable groups. The controversy goes back at least to Beauharnais versus Illinois in 1952, where the court endorsed the concept of group libel. From there, controversies over hate speech have evolved, again, to campus speech codes, to today's focus on speech attacking persons or groups based on their race, sex, religion, or sexual orientation. Today's speakers have a lot to say about hate speech, so let me quickly introduce them, and I'll turn the podium over to them. So the first person we will hear from is Judge Napolitano, who'll be reading the remarks of Nadine Strawson, the John Marshall II Professor of Law at New York Law School. Next is Greg Lukianoff, President and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, otherwise known as FIRE. Third up is Sahar Aziz, Associate Professor of Law at Texas A&M Law School. And finally, our fourth speaker is Jeremy Waldron, University Professor at the NYU School of Law. This is a very remarkably accomplished panel, all experts on the concept of hate speech, and we're looking forward to what they say. I'll turn the mic now over to Judge Napolitano.
Thank you, Dean. As you know, these remarks were prepared by my longtime friend and colleague in the study of the Constitution, Professor Nadine Strawson. So this is indeed a test of my abilities to advance ideas, to read someone else's words as if they were yours, whether you fully agree with these words or not. So I may from time to time reveal the snarky side of my personality, familiar to many of you already, as I comment on the words that I've been asked to read. And I shall not do my best Nadine Strawson imitation. I shall present the words with what I believe will be the same force and compelling arguments with which she would make them. She is indeed a nationally recognized scholar on the freedom of speech, and is a mainstay in the American Civil Liberties Union, and is a wonderful and delightful person to share any time with, a good friend of our colleague, Professor Susan Herman as well. Many thanks to Joel for organizing this important conference, and to Liz Alpers, I don't know who this is, but Liz Alpers for her helpful assistance with the arrangements. Of course I know who that is. The topic of hate speech brings to mind the following statement by the ACLU's principal founder, Roger Baldwin, quote, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." In the late 1970s, the ACLU won the famous or infamous Skokie case, which epitomizes what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of our free speech doctrine, that it protects freedom, even indeed especially for the thoughts that we hate. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously put it, then, about a decade after the Skokie case, we saw the advent of campus hate speech codes, which were advocated as advancing equality for students who had traditionally faced discrimination. In response, the ACLU revisited its longstanding position on the hate speech issue. Now I deviate from the text. The issue that the ACLU, which we all know about, this is a historic event, was visiting was the tension between freedom and equality. And given its longstanding commitment to equality, its troublesome tension between freedom of speech and equality. Back to the text now. Based on that reexamination, the ACLU resoundingly reaffirmed its traditional opposition to suppressing hate speech. Not at all. Those words are in caps, hence I raised my voice, because the ACLU elevated free speech above equality, but to the contrary, because it was convinced that censoring hate speech would be at best ineffective for advancing equality, and at worst, counterproductive. Now again, with the welcome recent resurgence of campus activism in support of equality in the past couple of years, we have again been hearing calls to restrict speech, particularly speech which is motivated by hatred. I deviate from the text, particularly hatred which is based on immutable characteristics of birth. So I, Professor Strawson, have again revisited this important recurring issue with a reopened mind. For one thing, even if the arguments against suppressing more speech turn out to be as compelling as ever, which is my, Professor Strawson's, conclusion, by definition, these arguments haven't been made as persuasively as necessary to convince the many young people who say they don't understand them. So thanks for this conference for providing a welcome opportunity to revisit and reinvigorate Professor Strawson's critical thinking on this critical issue. As she said, her reexamination has led her to reaffirm the ACLU's prior conclusions, but this reexamination has also led her to reformulate her own explanation of this clash, I deviate from the text, between equality and freedom. To the text. For one thing, I want to start any such explanation by stressing how much hate speech may already be punished because of some specific harm that it has caused beyond its psychic or emotional impact. So it's actually misleading to say that we may not punish hate speech under traditional First Amendment principles. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has held, and many civil libertarians agree, that we may punish the substantial subsets of hate speech that may inflict certain serious harm that the court has specifically identified, such as threats, harassment, incitement, and crimes that are motivated by hatred. Thus, any new First Amendment exception would be warranted only if we also wanted to punish hate speech that causes none of these harms, but rather causes solely psychic or emotional harm or personal discomfort to the listener. From now on, I will be referring to this subset of hate speech, the subset that is now constitutionally protected, as psychically harmful hate speech. To resist punishing psychically harmful hate speech is not at all to deny that such speech can indeed cause palpable, measurable psychic harms. We protect speech precisely because of its great power to affect our emotions and our psyches, both negatively and positively. To explain why, let me quote an old saying with which everyone in the room is familiar. The cure can often be worse than the disease. Even worse than speech's power to wound would be the government's power to pick and choose which among the infinite array of wounding words it will permit and which among the infinite array of wounding words it will punish. By so doing, government would strip us, individuals, of the power to choose which powerful words we will utter and which powerful words we will hear. As well, which ones we will ignore, reject, and answer back. And this power will also undermine the essential goal of equality, which always has depended upon a robust freedom of speech, sufficiently robust to extend to hated ideas, including ideas that challenge the status quo. This conclusion recently has been strongly endorsed by someone who has special expertise on the subject, both because he has taught constitutional law and because he has been a frequent target of vicious hate speech. I'm referring to the President of the United States. In several recent interviews, he has repeatedly endorsed the cardinal free speech principle, that the appropriate response to psychically harmful hate speech is not to censor it, but to answer it. And President Obama has stressed that this approach is essential for both civil rights and democracy. Let me quote just a few of the President's forceful remarks. Quote, "The civil rights movement happened because the leadership consistently sought to understand the views of the other side, even when those views were appalling to them. Quote, anybody you disagree with, you should have an argument with them,
but you shouldn't silence them by saying, I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. Quote, yes, this may put a slightly higher burden on minority students, but you're not going to make the kinds of deep changes in society that those students want without taking on their opponents in a courageous way, and that cannot be done in an atmosphere devoid of the freedom of speech. Quote, the purpose of protecting hate speech, these are quotes from President Obama, is to make sure that we are forced to use argument and reason. You don't have to be fearful of someone spouting bad ideas. Just out-argue them. Win over adherence to your view. That's how things work in a democracy. End of the quotes from the president. In my many previous writings and talks on this topic, I have explained many reasons for the conclusion, which President Obama has endorsed, that censoring psychically harmful hate speech would actually disserve equality goals. In my short time today, I can only list some of those reasons beyond the ones I have already articulated. Censoring such speech increases attention to and sympathy for the bigots who utter it. It drives bigoted expression and ideas underground, thus making it harder to identify who holds them, harder to know who they are, harder to identify them, harder to refute them. It necessarily can address only the crudest, most vulgar expressions of discrimination, leaving untouched the more subtle, influential, and insidious ones because they will no longer be articulated in a public forum. Laws against psychically harmful hate speech are inevitably enforced disproportionately against speech by and on behalf of members of whatever groups are relatively disempowered and marginalized in the particular community. Such dissident minority perspectives should always be heard in our democracy, not only because of the speaker's free speech rights, but also so the rest of us can be aware of their views and respond to them. Moreover, in some communities, the marginalized and hence silenced voices will include the very racial and other minority groups who are intended beneficiaries of the free speech regulation, of the hate speech regulations. This censorship reinforces paternalistic stereotypes about members of minority groups, suggesting that they need special protection from offensive speech. And this censorship undermines a mainstay of the equal rights movements, which have always been especially dependent on a robust concept of free speech. It curbs candid intergroup dialogue about racism and other bias, which is an essential precondition for reducing discrimination. Positive intergroup relations will more likely result from education and discussion about misunderstandings and insensitivity, whereas laws targeting psychically harmful hate speech will generate controversy and litigation, increasing intergroup tensions. Last but far from least, censorship is diversionary, diverting us from far more meaningful strategies for combating discrimination. Let me quote one example from a recent New York Times article. Victor DeJesus, co-president of the Wisconsin Student Association, said that he initially supported the University of Wisconsin's hate speech rule, but that he had changed his mind because he felt university officials were using it as an excuse to avoid the real problems of minority students on campus. Mr. DeJesus said, quote, now they can finally start putting their efforts into some of our major concerns like financial aid, student awareness, and student recruitment. Those of us who support increased efforts to advance equality and concur with President Obama that suppressing psychically harmful hate speech is not an appropriate, effective, constitutional, or moral tool, have a special responsibility to promote other approaches that are effective. The ACLU has consistently done that, including, to cite a current example, by defending the constitutionality of affirmative action admissions programs. So let me sum up the balance of what we would gain and what we would lose by censoring psychically harmful hate speech. The plus side from the perspective of those who seek suppression is quite limited. That's because the new suppression would extend only to a subset of hate speech, since we may already punish hate speech that causes specific, tangible harms because of the activity it animates, like threats and incitement. And even when that newly suppressible, even of that newly suppressible subset, we could only punish yet another subset, namely the most blatant expressions. In contrast, on the cost side, there would be an incalculably chilling effect on any speech that challenges the prevailing orthodoxy in any community, including in some communities, speech that challenges discrimination and inequality. And there would also be the multiple costs to the equality goals that I have listed. The net loss for both speech and equality were well summarized by Professor Henry Louis Gates, the longtime chair of Harvard's African American Studies Department, as follows, quote, "Speech codes are symbolic acts. They let a group of people say, we are not the sort of community where we would tolerate someone saying the N-word. Well, big deal. But there are consequences, like the effect on freedom of inquiry. I think we're all bigger and more secure than that. I think we have to allow people to say even popular, nasty, and hateful things in order to protect our right to attack the government and say whatever is on our minds." For Professor Strawson, nursing her stomach wounds, thank you very much.
So I want to give the perspective of someone who works on free speech issues on campus every day. And my argument is, and I think it's bounded by history, is that we talk about we need hate speech codes in the U.S. We need hate speech codes. We've had hate speech codes in the U.S. for decades. They've been on college campuses, and they have been a failed experiment. And I want to show you how they actually end up working in the real world. But first I want to clarify a couple things about what I do. It's kind of funny, because if you talk to people on different sides of the political spectrum, if you talk about defending free speech on college campuses, if someone's favorable, they'll immediately talk about, oh, those crazy politically correct people, or if they're unfavorable, like, oh, you defend Nazis. And I'm like, well, actually, an awful lot of our cases are, for example, defending someone's right to hand out constitutions outside of a tiny little free speech swamp, telling people that tiny little gazebo can't be the only place to engage in free speech activities on their campus. It was for 28,000 students at Texas Tech University. Then, you know, and then you'll also even juvenile jokes, or for the right, like the Cox joke at Tufts. That's a play on words for coxswain. They're rowers, and for that matter, to defend Second Amendment rights. But you know, I do end up oftentimes in the culture war defending speech that would be called hate speech. These are actually my very first appearance on TV, a lot different, was debating Daniel Pipes in the lower corner on MSNBC about whether or not Sami Al-Arian, a professor at University of South Florida, should be fired for saying death to Israel, and in something that was shown in something that was taped in 1989. On the other side, this was probably one of the highlights of my times of being on TV, was being on Hannity and Combs and watching them not being able to wrap their head around the fact that I was both defending the free speech rights of Ward Churchill, but also defending the rights of students to protest Ward Churchill. And they kept on asking me, whose side are you on? And I'm like, okay, again, I'm on free speech's side on this one. So we don't have to go too deeply into the law here, and this is a series of things that are protected by the First Amendment. The American First Amendment is strong. I think it's incredibly well thought out. I think actually a lot of times European scholars don't give it nearly as much credit as it deserves for its the level of sophistication, but it does have a bedrock principle that offensiveness alone does not proscribe speech. So for example, and that comes from an opinion when we said that in America you can burn a flag. That's considered, we can't ban it just because people find it offensive, that you can burn crosses, as long as they're not designed to convey a threat of harm. You can burn one in your backyard if you want. You can even be the Westboro Baptist Church, or on a college campus, radical students who wanted to protest police brutality and failed, decided to, a woman, Barbara Papish, decided to represent cops as raping the Statue of Liberty and raping the Goddess of Justice, and that was found easily to be protected by the Supreme Court in 1973. So this is not primarily a legal argument. The law is very much against hate speech codes in the U.S. With that being said, one thing about the history of speech codes that people either don't know or often get wrong is that they're very aware that there were hate speech codes in they were a very popular movement on the 80s and 90s. What people tend not to know is that these took the form, oftentimes, of extremely overbroad harassment codes. Harassment isn't so much considered an exception to freedom of speech as so much a pattern of discriminatory behavior that is where the speech is relatively insignificant. It's more of the pattern of directed behavior. But in the 1970s and 80s, scholars started looking for different ways to ban hate speech using existing American law. And time after time, they failed. They struck out in court, at least. But it also had some, but as I said, this isn't primarily about the state of the law. We know the state of the law. But interestingly, let's look at the very first test drive for speech codes on American college campuses. Doe v. Michigan. And this was a strong language. It was saying any behavior, verbal or physical, that stigmatizes or victimizes an individual on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and creed. Now, that was struck down in a case called Doe v. Michigan in 1989, and we all know this. But what's interesting about it is part of the history that is also in the opinion is this was overwhelmingly used against black students during the time that it existed. The very people it was intended to prevent were the ones who were most often brought up on charges on it. And that's predictable. Exceptions to speech tend to favor those in power. And the idea that power can then will create this code and they won't abuse it at all or in favor of views that they believe is something that I'm pretty skeptical of. So, and what's... Yep.
Do you know that your slides are not changing?
My goodness, okay. I was changing them on this one and forgetting.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay, where's this one? Got it. Okay, so Doe v. Michigan. Oh, embarrassing. Okay, so maybe I'll just look up this one. So these are all opinions that involve, in which courts shot down different interpretations of hate speech codes that involved harassment. And you know, every single one of these involved an attempt, including at my alma mater, Stanford, 2 years before I got there, tried it. And everybody seemed to think that that was the end of hate speech codes because they were sort of laughed at in the court of public opinion. They were even defeated at private campuses. But that's not true. Actually, as we know from all of our research, the number of codes that were directed at hateful speech on campus actually increased after it was firmly established that they were unconstitutional. So these are speech code cases since then. This isn't a complete list. A lot of these also have to do with, for example, free speech zones, those cases where they tell protesters they can only be in a tiny little area of campus. And so interestingly, after, at this point, close to 36 lawsuits since 1989 against speech codes, nonetheless, about 45% of universities maintain hate speech codes. But when we first started, or speech codes that include hate speech codes, when we first started doing it, it was actually 75%. So the idea that there's dozens and dozens of losing cases against hate speech codes or against different speech codes on college campuses, and still nearly 50% of universities maintain them. So I want to give some examples of the kind of thing that actually got in trouble before the latest round of a national hate speech code, which I'm going to explain. Now this is a classic case, but this is fairly typical in my experience. This is Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. This is a student reading a book called Notre Dame versus the Klan. He was found guilty of racial harassment without so much as a hearing because that cover offended somebody, literally judging a book by its cover. Now, what makes this ironic, but no more or less protected, is the fact that this is a book that celebrates the defeat of the Klan when they marched on Notre Dame. Of course, if he was reading Mein Kampf, he'd be protected to read that as well. But it took the combined efforts of the ACLU, FIRE, and the Wall Street Journal to get this university to fully back down. So, and that was before the latest Office of Civil Rights, Department of Education blueprint, which is an expansive harassment code that simply bans unwelcome sexual speech. And it also explicitly gets rid of the reasonable person standard. Now, let's go a little further into the fact that it doesn't just include sex, because when the Department of Education and Department of Justice was allowed to define what the protected categories were, which they reached in settlement with the University of Montana, that included a very long list of race, color, religion, national origin, creed, service in uniform, veteran status, sex, age, political ideas, marital or family status, pregnancy, physical or mental disability. Again, this was done with the help of the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. This is a hate speech code you could only dream of in terms of expansiveness. And in my opinion, it's wildly unconstitutional. So I will tell you what people generally think of when they think of hate speech codes. They think of cases like this at University of Oklahoma, where students were videotaped singing a racist chant. And I'd like to point out, this was done without any reference to a hate speech code, and these students were kicked out. And in my opinion, and also the opinion of Erwin Chemerinsky and Eugene Volokh, violations of due process and freedom of speech in both cases. But nonetheless, this is the typical case that people think of. And I got to tell you, this is not the typical case that I see on college campuses. I see things a lot more like this, where students actually got in trouble for doing an April Fool's edition of their student magazine, in which they actually included this image from, anybody know the movie? You can probably read it. From the movie Patch Adams, where they were making a joke about vagina-shaped buildings, and they were brought up on charges of harassment. It was a 9-month investigation there. There's also this. I can understand why it's more jarring, but this was the point of the art. It was supposed to be jarring. And this is a Turkish-born artist who wanted to protest racism on campus by making a effigy of the Klan and including articles about lynchings from the turn of the century to protest racism. But this was found to be racist itself and banned at University of Iowa. Oh, and the next one, okay. And so as I said, these end up being tools used by power. So for example, Northwestern University, Alice Dreger stepped down from the university because she was told she couldn't print racy material in her magazine, The Atrium. And it was interesting. They used the language of harassment and hate speech codes to justify that they wanted to protect their brand from racy stories like this one. And this, I don't think it was a racy story at all, about a woman who decided not to have a breast reconstruction surgery, but rather get a tattoo, or a story about someone who, and this is a racy story, but it's a story about someone who was a quadriplegic after Vietnam, and about how he found, he sort of found himself sexually again because he received oral sex at one point, and how it changed his way of thinking about things. Now, that was considered harmful to the brand of Northwestern, but it was put into the language of hate speech, and Alice Dreger resigned only a couple months ago. Then you have the case of Laura Kipnis, same thing. She was investigated because she wrote an article critical of Title IX and critical of a Title IX lawsuit. Students at her school who brought the Title IX lawsuit brought her up on charges under Title IX, the same harassment code that I've been talking about, the blueprint. So even criticizing the law that she was eventually said gone too far, went too far, and actually she was brought up on charges underneath it. And I think she would have probably faced the end of her career if it hadn't been for the fact that she was brave enough to publish this all in the Chronicle of Higher Education. She went public with this. Now, this is something that might be interesting to those of you in the crowd, and it is just the big disconnect between attitudes about hate speech codes and attitudes about freedom of speech between millennials and the rest of the population. As you can see, millennials are much more comfortable with the idea of policing freedom of speech for offensive speech, and I think that might be encouraging to people like Waldron, not so encouraging to people like me. And it's really dramatic. You see 43%, and this is a very recent study, this is one that's done by the UCLA every year, saying 43% of students support 43% of students support British-style no platforming of quote-unquote extreme points of view. That's pretty troubling to me because I think if you really question them, everyone believes in someone who might be considered an extreme point of view by someone. And a record 71%, an all-time high, 71% believe that racist or sexist speech should be banned on campus. And I want to point out again, that is very out of step with how the rest of what rest of the country thinks. And this is what the result that I think it ends up having. Now, this is a flawed study in my opinion. But it asked the question 5 years ago, which was comparatively a golden age for freedom of speech and academic freedom on college campuses. Do you believe it is safe to hold unpopular points of view on your campus? And what was really interesting about it was the longer you were on campus, the more skeptical you became that it was safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. And guess who the most skeptical group of all was about how safe it is to hold unpopular views on campus? Professors. Only 16.7% of professors asked strongly believe that it was safe to merely hold unpopular points of view on campus. And again, this was 5 years ago, when, from my experience, it was actually comparatively tame. But this has all been about sort of what it really looks like in the trenches, what it really looks like on campus. It has for a while. But I do want to leave you with a final provocation, because it is, to some degree, taken for granted that people like me are supposed to concede that hate speech is valueless speech. I actually don't believe it's value of speech, but here's why. I think it's always important to know what people actually think, and I think it's hopelessly naive to think you're safer not knowing what people actually believe. As Harvey Silverglate puts it, if there are Nazis in the room, I want to know who I can't turn my back to. And, and this case is a very interesting case of paternalism at Williams, and this is just from last week. This student wanted to invite John Derbyshire, who is a conservative columnist who's written on mathematics. He's also a racist. He's written some pretty racist material. He was actually fired from National Review for writing racist material. But nonetheless, this African-American liberal student wanted to have him at Williams campus for a series called Uncomfortable Learning so he could debate him. And he was overruled by the president of Williams. The white, rich president of Williams told this student that he can't actually debate a racist, even though he thought that would actually lead to greater extent, a chance to actually refute rather than deny. And it was amazing how much better of a job the student did of understanding, I think, the idea of give and take, the idea of debating rather than suppressing, than his own university president. So in conclusion, I just want to make sure that you have my contact info if you ever want to reach me. I'm sorry I'm going to have to leave right after this panel, but wish me luck and wish everybody else luck that we don't end up getting hurt or sick.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Gora. Thank you to the students of the Journal. It's an honor to be here. This is my first time at Brooklyn Law. I have some colleagues that have graduated from here and have spoken very highly of the law school. So congratulations on your symposium. So I am not going to talk about doctrine. I have a few confessions to make. The first is I am not a First Amendment scholar. That is not what I spend the majority of my research time on. So I will not be spouting off many Supreme Court cases and engaging in kind of doctrinal analysis. I would like to focus more on the backdrop in which many of these conversations are made, with particular focus on Muslims in the United States, which, as you know, have become the most popular punching bag these days with politicians on the right. A few other confessions to make. First is I'm in a very complex situation where, personally, where I study authoritarianism and oppression in the Middle East, and I have very strong views against authoritarianism and appreciate very much how the lack of political freedoms, including freedom of speech and expression, can be extremely harmful to individuals and to societies. I also know what it feels like and have experienced the wonderful privileges of being a member of the majority in a society, which would be the Muslims in Egypt, which is where I'm originally from and I visit often and study intensively. And it's awesome being in the majority. I love it. I also know what it's like to be a member of the minority as a Muslim in the United States. It's not fun, particularly if you happen to be among the most despised or least liked or suspected minority within the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy. So I understand the complexities personally and in the abstract. So with that, I'm going to try to at least portray a certain perspective and maybe challenge some of what I think are some very formalistic views of free speech and sometimes discussed a little too abstract, in abstract notions. But I am by no means trying to come up with some panacea or some solution, because it is very complicated. But I hope that I can at least today let you see the perspective of, quote unquote, the victims, because oftentimes the people who are speaking about the First Amendment are not necessarily members of the victim class. And that's a different perspective. Oh. Thank you. So these are some of the key points that I'd like to make, overarching. The first, and I think for me this is a matter of fact, is that Muslim bashing is now on the menu of nativist xenophobia that's being peddled by politicians on the political right. One need only look at Trump, Cruz, Carson, Herman Cain, and your poll numbers go up for it. So not only is it is not looked on as shame on you, it is, yes, let's do more. Now, of course, there are other targets like Latinos under the rubric of immigration reform and LGBT communities, et cetera. But one would want, I always ask, is it more acceptable, is it less politically costly, and is it actually beneficial to Muslim bash? You also have the media that corroborates these tropes of the terrorist other. When all the coverage about Islam is about Daesh, which are about, what, 14,000 barbaric fighters out of 1.5 billion Muslims in America, in the world, if that's all you see, of course you're going to think Muslims are terrorists, and of course you're going to want to ban them from the country, and of course you're not going to want to bring in these poor Syrian refugees who have gone through atrocious violence, to which we as a country claim to be a leading voice against human rights in the world, and yet we can't let them into our country because we feel so strongly against Muslims or Islam. And so I argued in 2009 article that anti-Muslim bias is no longer a backlash. So anyone who tells you it's just backlash, it's temporary, it's part of the trauma of the country dealing with the horrific September 11th attacks, I think that's false. I think the facts show that it is now a staple part of American racist politics, or racism, or the race landscape. So we need to address it when we're dealing with anti-Black or anti-Latino or anti-gay or anti-Jewish, et cetera. It is now officially on the menu for, I think, a long time, if not permanently. And we have to accept the fact that it produces very tangible harms. Yes, of course, there are psychological harms. To me, that's the least of my concerns, as somebody who used to be an advocate and out in the field litigating and advocating, and still work a lot with these communities. They're suffering from hate crimes, physical attacks. Women who wear headscarves are afraid to be in public. They are afraid to walk around in the streets. They are afraid to be driving their cars in untinted windows, because they will be attacked, they will be spit on, they will be verbally assaulted. Muslims are very concerned, they're trying to hide their Muslim identity at work. So those who maybe don't cover their hair or are not ostensibly Muslim will try to change their names even. I'm not sure if that's the type of America they came, well, I'm pretty sure that's not the America they immigrated to, and I'll tell you a little bit about the immigration status. There's a lot of bullying in schools, so people are really concerned about their kids. The mosques are being vandalized, and that, in addition to being an insult to the sanctity of the house of worship, mosques are schools, they are community centers, people bring their kids there, and they don't want to worry about it being firebombed, about being arsoned, about the playgrounds being attacked while their children are playing. So this is a different existence than you are experiencing in the same country. This is not what's happening in Syria or in Iraq or in Egypt. And then generally there's just a climate of suspicion, a climate of distrust, this constantly having to prove that you are loyal, that you are not a threat, that you are assimilated, that you are okay and should be accepted and hopefully at least not discriminated against. So ultimately you have this de facto second-class citizenship problem, which I think is something we all should be concerned about as much as we're concerned about free speech, because ultimately we're trying to produce equality, and Nadine Strassen through Judge Napolitano I identified that tension, which I think is a really important one and a difficult one to address, but ultimately, I'm focused on equal citizenship rights. And then I also want to highlight something that the very few people talk about and I think is worthy of a symposium in and of itself, which is the hollow rights of Muslims to have free speech. What happens if Muslims go and start talking about how much they disagree with foreign policy, American foreign policy? If they say that what we're doing in the Middle East is producing more terrorism, that we ourselves engage in terrorism through state violence, that we breed terrorism in the Middle East through our foreign policy and through our military interventions, and that what we did in Iraq is, there's blood on our hands. What happens to them? What if some of them even go as far as saying, I understand why Daesh does what it does, I understand why its violence works and why it engages in that, and they entertain trying to understand what's going on as opposed to having to absolutely condemn it blindly to prove their loyalty. I'll tell you what happens. They end up getting placed under surveillance, they get prosecuted, they get shamed, people confirm that in fact they are terrorists, and then their quality of life goes down even more, and usually their liberty stakes are worse. So my point here is if you're going to staunchly defend free speech, think very closely whether you're defending the free speech of those who are targeted by hate in ways that don't simply dismiss them, discount them, stigmatize them, make them radicals, crazy criminals. Because if you do, then you're really not committed to free speech in the same way that you may think you are. Okay, so let's look at I just want to show you this because a lot of people don't know. There's about between 3 to 6 million Muslims. Nobody knows how many exactly. But there's a debate as to if it's as high as 6 or as low as 3. But if you look at their demographics, a vast majority of them are foreign-born. Or I should say a plurality are foreign-born. No, a majority, excuse me. So 38%, if the whites are primarily Arab Americans, they're North Africans and Middle Easterners because that is the category in which the census uses for that group, is they're white. And then you have 23% total blacks, 21% Asian, tends to be South Asian predominantly, although also Far East, Indonesia, Malaysia. But as you can see, the foreign-born is much higher. And I highlight that because many of them are new immigrants, literally foreign-born, not just first-generation Americans. So their kids are now first-generation Americans, and the second generation is just being born, literally. And that's very important because that's going to affect the issue of participatory access to the democratic system, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so these are some of the principles that Nadine Strassen's speech highlighted. And these are the tensions that we deal with. We always deal with tensions in law, and that's what I think makes law so interesting, is you have speech, but you also have safety. People have a right to be safe. They have a right not to be harassed, not to be, whether it's verbally, but more importantly, physically. They have a right to their dignity, and they have a right not to be subordinated. Now, free speech gives all of us dignity. I mean, I think the ability to speak out, to have free expression, is an important dignitary right. But are you doing it at the expense of other people? And if you feel comfortable doing that, then you need to accept that you are now a privileged first-class citizen and someone else is a second-class citizen, and you're contributing to that. And then we have to acknowledge that the United States of America has tiers of citizenships de facto. And maybe we're willing to live with that. But I don't think that's what we're taught in schools. And so I would just like us to be a little bit more honest about the realities or the consequences in which some of these very formalistic principles produce. You also have the tension of the tyranny of the majority versus the protection of minority rights. The marketplace of ideas and the unequal access. Do you think that Muslims have the same access to the media, the same access to politicians, to people who have the bully pulpit? Yes, we can all speak, but what if your speech has no effect? What if your speech invites criminal action by law enforcement? What if your speech is completely ignored because, and maybe even affirmatively silenced, because you are not at the same starting point. You don't have the same access de facto as those who engage in the hate speech that subordinates you. And again, the disparate costs of speaking out. So different radicals are treated differently. I personally love the word radical. I think it's a compliment. When if someone calls me a radical, I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But not in every context is being a radical cool in the sense that it creates, it's not a compliment and it creates problems for you. And some radicals are in fact extremists, but it's okay to be that extremist, but you can't be that extremist. So there's a lot of discrimination in the way that we allow people to speak out, and again, I think it relates to power. Okay, and these are some of the concepts of First Amendment theory, which many of you should know if you've taken a First Amendment class, but I'm just highlighting them because we all have these rights to self-fulfillment, to ascertaining the truth, to securing participation as members of society, to maintaining that balance. So I agree with all of this. I'm just concerned that the way in which we sometimes approach the First Amendment may implicitly be privileging those particular rights of the majority, and the majority could be those with more political power, with more wealth, numeric majorities, but those who have privileges. And we may not realize that it is coming at the expense of other people in the country. Okay, I'm not going to go over this because this is just pure the doctrine. So I do acknowledge, though, obviously the law is not necessarily on my side. Okay, but this is kind of what my talk comes down to, is what if your right to hate, which I acknowledge, I feel sorry for people who hate, I think they have psychological problems, And I think that they're tormented inside if all you do is hate. I mean, I feel more sympathy for them. But what if it infringes on my right to be left alone, meaning I don't want to be harassed, I don't want people to intervene in my life in a negative way, and to be safe, which is even more existential. And me meaning myself, my children, my family, my mother, people who are ostensibly Muslim. And I'm assuming that part of my right is to practice my faith. So you could say, well, just don't wear a headscarf, right? Don't do anything. Hide your identity. Pretend that you are someone else. Maybe I could pretend I was a Latina, and then I would have different types of hate speech directed at me depending where I was in the country. But maybe that's less harmful, because not all of us can pass to be members of the majority that have the benefits of being left alone and safe. But I think this is really what it comes down to, and I think this is what I'd like you to think about when you get into the formalistic notions, to which I agree with. Formalistic, when I'm thinking in the abstract, it sounds wonderful. But we're lawyers, and so we apply a lot of the facts. Okay, so let me go over, I'm going to go a little quickly over this because a lot of this is visual, but I think it's important. Okay, so first, you have all of these stereotypes, right, that are permeating through society. Muslims are not the only ones who suffer through stereotypes, but we have to acknowledge the role of stereotypes and how they affect policy, how they affect law, how they affect people's behavior. So a headscarf used to be, now San Bernardino actually really brought this stereotype to light. But it used to be before 9/11, the headscarf woman was subjugated, oppressed, white, upper middle class feminist Americans needed to save her, but now she's a threat, now she's a co-conspirator, and now she's probably hiding something illicit. This is actually a poster that was in Texas in 2012. It was just after I'd relocated from Washington, D.C. to Texas. It was my welcome back experience. It was shown by a business in Houston, in the Houston area, openly. Fine, you want to do that, but that it just shows that we have a really serious problem. We may not be advancing as much as we can, and of course there's a lot going on there from the lynching and the symbolism of the lynchings. This is some of the ads. So you all have been also in New York City. There's a lot of tensions in terms of free speech and things that what I would argue is openly anti-Muslim / Islamophobic. But all of these things are reinforcing to everyone Muslims are terrorists, only think of them as terrorism. And that then affects law enforcement's behavior, and it affects the public's behavior in the various fora that I discussed. In a 2011 poll, so this is a bit dated, although it's actually gotten worse since, the percentage of Muslim Americans who were interviewed, 28% people have acted suspicious toward them, 22% have been called offensive names, 21% singled out in the airport, 13% singled out by law enforcement, 6% threatened or attacked. So what's your threshold number? What does it take? If you're a member of that community, is that acceptable, 1/4? And if you're not a member of that community, you look at that and go, well, they're just going to have to get thicker skin. Just don't be so sensitive. Okay. So how about you get thicker skin too? Have you ever had the existence of constantly having to defend yourself, constantly being offended and having names said about you and your identity? It's a really unhappy life. Again, I've lived the life of a majority. It's awesome. I love it. Life is good. My psychological well-being is stable. I don't have to deal with microaggressions. I don't have to deal with all this negativity in my life. And I can focus on my work. I can focus on my studying. I can focus on my family because I'm not distracted with all the garbage, right? The psychic garbage and the physical insecurity that comes with that. So those are two different experiences. This is I'm sorry, the numbers got cut off. This is just to show you a trend. This is from a Council of American Islamic Relations, the complaints they were getting, which is a major source of, this is where most Muslims will call to say, I'm concerned for, I believe I've been discriminated against. It doesn't necessarily mean it reaches to a level of actionable litigation or an actionable lawsuit, but it shows trends. So the workplace is a major source of it, and also government agencies, which usually means law enforcement. And this is a report, it's 2009, I don't think it has been updated, I think the money's gotten larger. But this isn't a coincidence. I wanted to just point this out because there's hate that just arises out of ignorance. There's hate that arises out of the lack of education and exposure to different groups. And then there's intentional, malicious, premeditated hate. And maybe you don't distinguish it from a First Amendment perspective, but I think normatively we need to identify it. And if only to encourage you to engage in more speech against it, because this has a lot to do with the current environment that these 3 to 6 million people have to live in. So the Center for American Progress did a report. There's at least from 2001, 2009, there was $42 million going into planned campaigns to portray Sharia as essentially terrorism law, to portray Muslims as as sleeper cells, to argue that mosques were breeding grounds for terrorism, all of which is not based in fact. The Southern Poverty Law Center showed that in 2011, the number of hate groups that were specifically focused on Muslims tripled from 10 to 30 in 1 year. Now, I will say that Obama's election had something to do with that as well, because Obama is the intersection of anti-black and anti-Muslim hate. So that is not an irrelevant, significant development. And these are some of the folks that claim to be experts, and I'm sure many of you have heard of them, and some of them are on mainstream media, usually on the right of center. And they have made a living, a lucrative living, out of trying to convince the public that it is completely reasonable to distrust Muslims and that in fact anyone who's defending their civil rights is a stealth terrorist and all kinds of, I'm not going to go into it, and you can, but they have a strong following, particularly in certain parts of the country, who have very minimal exposure to Muslims, and who then, because people have started to study the impact of these groups, but interestingly, many of them will cite them, people who are in fact charged with a hate crime, or people who are leading very vocal hate movements will cite them. So congratulations to them, they've been very effective. And ultimately, so I want to focus a little bit more on hate crimes before I wrap up, but as you know, a hate crime is any criminal offense, and it has to be motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, gender identity. That's the federal definition. There's 45 states who have hate crimes. Not all of them will include sexual orientation or gender identity. That's where you have some disagreements. But ultimately, it's to spread fear, oppression, and intimidation. And some will argue that, or those who think that the First Amendment doctrine is a little bit too broad or too formalistic, is that perhaps we should also have, should we have a tort, a hate tort? I decided that I wasn't going to spend my time making that doctrinal argument, but again, thinking about what do we do about this, because I'm not convinced that more speech is the solution because of many structural problems and impediments that I've been discussing in terms of the power disparities. 2013, there were about 1,223 hate crimes that were religious bias motivated. The vast majority were against Jewish Americans, 60.3, 60%.3, 13.7% against Muslims. You go to 2014, and the number is increasing against Muslims. So Jewish Americans are still the target of hate crimes that are religiously motivated, and Muslims are increasing. The 2015 numbers are not up yet, but we're seeing a trend. This is not happenstance. This is not a coincidence. Let's look at the polls. So Zogby had a poll in 2014. 27% had a favorable opinion of Muslims. 32% had a favorable opinion of Arabs. As you know, Arabs are Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But most people don't know the difference between an Arab and a Muslim. 42% believe an American's religion would influence his or her decision-making in an important government job. That sounds a little bit from the anti-Catholic days when people were questioning Kennedy. And 42% believed it was justified to engage in profiling, in racial profiling, and religious profiling. And in 2001, which was 5 years ago, 47% of Americans believed that Muslim and American values are incompatible. And all of these people act out on, no, not all of them act out on these views, but this is a prerequisite for those types of actions that then infringe on a person's right to be left alone and to be safe. I'm not going to read all these, but this is just in the month of December. 36 at least have been, there's more, but 36 that I was able to find, hate crimes. These are not offensive statements. This is not quote unquote hate speech. These are hate crimes. Now, San Bernardino shootings had a lot to do with it. But you've got to have a right foundation. Does everybody go and start attacking evangelical Christians when an abortion clinic gets bombed? And if they do, there is usually an entire, 5, 10 years, you've got to get them to that point where they can decide, I'm going to punish collectively all of you through physical violence because one of you engaged in or is accused of engaging in a terrorist act. Right? There's some more. And they're all over the country: New Jersey, Seattle, Phoenix, Tampa, Texas, California. And I just want to highlight, look at December 10th, men set fire to Somali restaurant. Think about the irony of that. So you have these Somali communities who fled a war-torn region, sought refugee status in America, thinking they would come to the land of the free, they would be safe, and they could start a business, and they could become self-reliant, and they can start a new life. And some crazy guy and his wife engage in a shooting spree in San Bernardino, and now this guy in North Dakota's restaurant. This is just one small story. So this is the reality that many of these individuals are going through. And this just shows that the mosque vandalizations have gone up significantly. So you have 29 violence and vandalization and damage, and 71 total. Okay, so here are just some pictures. This was a mosque that was burned down, literally. And then you all know that the Sikh temple, people thought, the perpetrator thought they were Muslim. Okay, so just to wrap up, I want to kind of loop back to this. And I don't have any answers because I am committed to the First Amendment. I am committed to free speech. And I know, I study very deeply what societies are like that are ruled by authoritarian regimes. And it's the last thing I would want for this country to regress to that, particularly the right to oppose your government. But I would like to just remind you that perhaps we should be a little bit more nuanced and distinguish the places, the people, as opposed to lump everything together under free speech. So should we be distinguishing between public spaces versus the classroom, where the ultimate objective is to create a conducive learning environment for all students, which absolutely means we should have different views and different perspectives, but be very careful in how we allow those views to be discussed so that everybody feels that they can equally engage in the discussion. Should we distinguish between workplaces where the point is to go and get your job done, not to listen to your coworkers' offensive opinions that shouldn't have an effect on how you do your job, and so that you can focus on your job and not be emotionally drained and feeling the psychic harms of being harassed. And businesses where you're just going, this is a business. I'm not here to have a debate. Versus universities, which, yes, universities are very different. There's a purpose for universities that is very different than a purpose for a workplace or a business. Academic scholarship is very different. So media, I think, is very different. So perhaps we need to start being a little bit more, make some more distinctions, keeping in mind all of the perspectives of the target group and not being too consumed with the majority group's perspective. Thank you.
Good morning. Still morning, I think. I'm Jeremy Waldron. I read a book called The Harm and Hate Speech, and so I'm going to, I suppose, be speaking on that side, although I think it's unfortunate if we turn this into a CNN debate rather than a thoughtful, scholarly symposium. One of the differences between those two would be evident signs that each side is straining to understand the concerns of the other. One of the things I liked about the presentation that we just heard is the sense of principles and tension, and that there are things to be said on both sides, and there are ways in which each side is trying to get its best grip possible on the concerns that the other side has, and trying to perhaps deal with those concerns in a different way. And it's on that basis some degree of dialogue can happen on these matters. I used to be a great admirer of Salman Rushdie, and he was a person who suffered terribly by virtue of a denunciation of a book that he wrote. He's been traumatized by that, and I've heard him say, now, when anybody talks about limiting speech, I stop listening. When anybody talks about limiting speech, I stop listening, as though there were nothing that he could hear that would be relevant to a thoughtful assessment of these matters. I hope on both sides that that's not where we are going to be in our discussions today. So one of the things that I want to do, I do want to keep to my time, Professor Gora, because I know we're way over time, and the other panelists are gathering nervously in the wings, wondering if any time will be left for their panel as well. But I do want to try to set out some of the concerns that exist among those people and those countries that do either advocate for or have hate speech legislation. What's lying behind those? What's lying behind those concerns? And then secondly, to try to say something about the genuine apprehensions that such people have about free speech. They really understand that the position they have taken in favor of hate speech laws does involve very severe speech costs, very severe costs in terms of what we would call First Amendment values. And it's interesting to see how they conceive of those costs and how they might try to mitigate those costs. If we can think in those terms, then we can have a thoughtful discussion. I'm a New Zealander by origin, but I wanted to say just a couple of things about the background to hate speech laws in Great Britain. So the first wave of such laws is enacted in the 1960s in the Race Relations Act, pursuant to a determination in Britain that the country was becoming or was about to become a country of immigration, and that there were waves of immigrants coming not only from East Africa, but also from the Caribbean, and that British society was going to be put under a certain amount of strain because a society that had been accustomed to being mainly white, Anglophone, was Christian, was going to have to deal with different waves of people. And there was some concern, some of it notorious among conservatives like Enoch Powell, who said, if we allow this to happen, he said, I am like the old Romans who see the Tiber foaming with blood. He was worried. He expressed it intemperately, and it ruined a fine political career. But he was worried about the possibility of intercommunal hatred, intercommunal violence in these new circumstances that the people of the New Britain would have to become accustomed to. My understanding is that the government of the day, in enacting hate speech legislation, thought it was important to try to preempt the growth of intercommunal hatred. They thought that intercommunal hatred, where it does exist, is one of the worst things that can happen in a society. It wasn't just trying to protect people's tender feelings against, what was the phrase, Judge, that you used, quoting or ventriloquizing Nadine Strossen, psychic harms. It wasn't as though people had thin skins and were likely to be psychically harmed. There were concerns about social peace. There were concerns about social hatred, and the laws were phrased to reflect that. Anybody who publishes anything which is intended to stir up racial hatred. The hatred reference is not to the psychological state of the speaker. It's to the hatred that the person is trying to stir up in the community. And the concern was with that as a possible threat to the social environment. Now, we need to understand that that was their motivation. We may not think that this was an entirely sensible way to deal with it. There were probably other ways that it could have been addressed as well. In fact, other ways were addressed, because this was but one of hundreds of measures in the Race Relations Act. The second wave of hate speech legislation in Great Britain is much more recent, and it concerns issues about Britain's large Muslim population, and issues about concerns about terrorism, concerns about increasing religious diversity in the country, and exactly the concerns that Sahar Aziz has just set out for us. The government was embarking on what I think were ill-considered pieces of legislation to try to arrest and apprehend and detain those who engaged in speech that glorified terrorism. But whatever the merits of that ambition, they wanted it to be coupled with a provision that would focus on protecting people from religious hatred. They thought there was a potential, once you start with serious measures that are aimed at those who promote and glorify terrorism, there was a danger that that would then become associated with general Islamophobic, anti-Muslim sentiment in the community as a whole, of the sort that Sahar talked about. So it needed to be complemented by laws that would make it clear to the citizens that they had a responsibility, since their security was being secured in this way, to refrain from stirring up anti-Muslim hatred in this fashion. So the Religious Order Act, and that was a second wave of hate speech, legislation. Part of it was based on concerns about people's dignity, concerns about people's elementary social reputation, concerns about people's ability to live a life in a community without being exposed to waves of hatred that would seek to exclude and disqualify them. And I talked a lot about that in my little book, The Harm in Hate Speech. But part of it also was understood to be a concern, as I said, for social peace, and for a genuine worry about what would happen if British society became disfigured by intercommunal religious hatred of the sort that you see sometimes in, I don't know, India, sometimes you see it in Nigeria, sometimes you see it, I don't know, in Northern Ireland. So there was some first or second-hand experience of this. So concerns about dignity, concerns about social peace, and if I have any time left, I may say something about civility and campus codes. But these concerns are there, and it seems to me it's incumbent on everybody to think about these concerns. What we shouldn't be in the business of doing is, number one, not listening when these justifications are considered. We ought to try to find out the best we can about these laws that we condemn. If we do condemn them, and it's an honourable position to condemn them, but at least find out what was motivating them and consider how we would deal with those concerns if we decided not to have hate speech laws, which we're not going to have at that level, at the level of national or state laws in this society. So how are we going to deal with threats to social peace? How are we going to deal with waves of attacks on people's elementary social standing? How are we going to secure the civility that's necessary for the modern university? And on the other side, those who espouse or defend hate speech laws, those who claim, as I do, to understand how they're motivated, have to make the best effort possible to come and listen to strong cases for First Amendment values, and acknowledge that hate speech laws do pose costs in terms of free speech, and try to explain, if it's possible to explain, how those concerns about free speech can be accommodated within the scheme of a defense of hate speech legislation, or try to explain, if it's possible to explain, how those who defend these hate speech laws in every other advanced democracy except this one have reconciled those laws, if they can, with their concerns about free speech as well, with their concerns about the expressions in favor of free speech that are in their own constitutions or that are in the European Convention of Human Rights or the UK Human Rights Act and so on. So we know that among defenders of free speech in this country, among opponents of hate speech laws, there has been some effort to try to address the concerns that the defenders of hate speech laws have had. We heard when Judge Napolitano presented Nadine Strausson's remarks. She acknowledged that we already have a whole set of laws that can isolate large areas of hate speech, laws about harassment, laws about incitement, laws about threatening words, laws about fighting words. We take care of some of the concerns that motivate defenders of hate speech laws in that way. And opponents of hate speech laws say that they bend over backwards to make it clear that they are not condoning hate speech. They try to convey the abhorrence that they feel towards speech of the sort. Sometimes this is disingenuous, mostly it's not. Sometimes people don't really know how bad it is, which is why the presentation that we just heard is so important. But they make it clear that voices can be mobilized against the hate speech without necessarily having to legislate against it. And although one may be skeptical about whether more speech is the appropriate response if we are just dealing with hate speech in a debating context, still the more speech position is an honorable way of addressing these concerns. Not that the European countries that have hate speech laws eschew the more speech approach. Their hate speech laws are an additional weapon in the armory against hatred. It's important, I think, for people to open their minds as far as possible to the harms that hate speech cause, including the social harms of stirring up a great deal of hatred in the communities. But what I mostly wanted to say a little bit about in the time remaining is the way in which defenders of hate speech laws, whether they are in Britain or whether they are lone voices here, defenders of hate speech laws have to acknowledge and have to try to deal with the free speech costs of hate speech laws. Some of us have sometimes, in a ill-considered way, said there are no real free speech costs because hate speech isn't real speech or something like that. I don't think that's going to cut it. What we really want to say is, okay, these laws can be widely drawn or narrowly drawn. These laws can be designed carefully or designed carelessly. One of the things that we might do is to try to carefully distinguish the kinds of harm we're concerned about from the kinds of harm that we're not concerned about. So, in that second wave of laws that the British enacted in 2006 about religious hatred, they wanted to make it clear that they were not interested in people who defamed a religion. They were not interested in people who were offending each other's religious sensibilities. They were concerned with people who were stirring up hatred against a group on account of their religion. So you find in the Racial and Religious Hatred Act of 2006 a carefully drafted provision that says this is the famous Section 29J. Nothing in this part of the Act shall be read or given in effect in a way which prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of particular religions. That's okay. Abuse the religion. Make fun of the founder of the religion. Cast aspersions on Jesus if you like. Yeah? Nothing shall restrict discussion, criticism, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of particular religions or the beliefs or practices of their adherents, or proselytizing or urging adherents of a different religion or belief system to cease practicing their religion or belief system. It's specifically and verbosely accepted from the application of the Act in Section 29J, so that the Act can focus not on the way in which the religious believers are offended by criticism, but can focus on those who are deliberately stirring up hatred and trying to reduce the social standing and the social participation of people on account of their religious beliefs. So attacking Islam is not going to be a criminal offense, but attacking Muslims is going to be a criminal offense. Now, bending over backwards in that way to filter the effect of these laws is important. I think, although I greatly respected the presentation that Greg gave, and I do think we have to look at the hard cases that arise from ill-considered campus codes. There are two responses. One response is just to abandon the campus code idea altogether. The other response, which at least somebody has to try to take, is to work with a trial and error possibility and think of better or worse designed campus codes. Under the British Act, whether it's the Religious Hatred Act or the Racial Hatred provisions, there are limitations on who can initiate a prosecution under these matters. The prosecutions have to have the approval of the Attorney General rather than simply of the local DAs. They don't have DAs in Britain, but you know what I mean. It's not just a matter of the local police or the prosecutors. The prosecution's ability is filtered by requiring a responsible legal official, the Attorney General, in his or her neutral capacity, to authorize prosecutions only in the most egregious fashions. And thirdly, I mean, there's lots of others, but the third is the only one I have time for. There is an attention to adverbs. God loveth adverbs is one of the things that the Puritans, God loves the way you do your duty, not just that you do your duty. And God loveth adverbs in designating the particular forms of conduct that people are worried about. They're worried not just about attempts to stir up hatred, but attempts to stir up hatred which are in themselves threatening, abusive, or insulting. So there's an attempt by defining certain adverbs to provide a basis for a defense of the speaker, to provide a basis for the defense of the speaker, that he did not do this in a coarse or insulting or abusive way, but was presenting a considered view, trying in effect to concoct a kind of safe haven for certain forms of speech. And that's going to be very important for the few things that I want to say about campus codes in a moment. So those are ways in which the designers of hate speech laws can try to bend over backwards to accommodate some free speech concerns. Other free speech concerns, it's much harder to accommodate. Some of those that Nadine Strossen mentioned in her presentation about driving the bigots underground, or drawing undue attention to bigotry. Some of those concerns the defenders of hate speech laws swallow hard and say maybe it's worth the cost, but they are costs. Because I don't think either side should be in the business of denying the reality of the concerns that motivate the others. Now, I have about 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to say a little bit about campus speech codes. Because I thought it was important to emphasize that we have lying behind hate speech laws. We have concerns about protecting people's elementary dignity and the basis of their social reputations from imputation. I mean, not protecting them from psychic harm, but protecting them against the attempt systematically to exclude them. The attempt to convey to them, don't think you're welcome here because you're not. And a lot of us believe this. An attempt to make sure that message is driven home to their children and to their families and to their businesses and to their places of worship. Concerns about dignity, concerns about social peace. The third layer is concerns about civility. And I'm persuaded by my friend Robert Post, who was until recently, he still is, Dean of the Yale Law School, that it's very hard for legislatures to legislate civility. I do believe that many of the campus codes that we have seen are particularly concerned about the civility that is necessary for running a university, for creating an environment and an atmosphere in which people can safely study. So let's try and get at these concerns from the inside out. There's a law review, probably several law reviews published out of this building. And there are limits to what people can say in those law reviews. They can't use racial invective. They can't use expletives, except perhaps to laboriously make a point, like the point about fuck the government that was have been discussed an hour or two ago. We have obligations of scholarly civility. And in the classroom, in a law school classroom where the students are actively speaking in response to Socratic pressure from their professor, in the law school classroom, even somebody who hates half of the other members of the class is not permitted to spit out the vitriol or attempt to demean or to make it clear that the other members of the class are not welcome here. Part of what is involved in the training that we give people in law school or in any university setting is kind of house training in ways of bearing themselves and comporting themselves in their dealings with others. In a courtroom, you can't rely on a privilege of free speech to speak abusively, insultingly, or hatefully about others. A campus is not just a place where ideas are exchanged. A campus is a place where ideas are pursued in a scholarly atmosphere of mutual respect. And it's the hardest thing in the world, I will concede, acknowledging the way these codes tend to be abused. It's the hardest thing in the world to try to legislate for that in a campus atmosphere. But it is not just a free-for-all. We are creating people, we are giving them degrees, we are certifying them as people who have been able to come to terms with difficult ideas in a civil, respectful, and ultimately professional way. And I think that's tremendously important. It's the hardest thing to do. I'm going to finish. But what I want to say is we should try at least to understand the motivations of those who are trying to do this. It's not just turf protection. It's not just trying to close down opposing views. It is, at least in large part, trying to secure an atmosphere of something approaching professional and responsible civility. So, protecting people's dignity, protecting social peace, protecting civility, these seem to me to be legitimate concerns, even if our judgment in the last analysis is that codes and laws are the wrong way of doing that. So as they say in the Godfather movies, do me a favor, take this into consideration. Thank you very much.